Here. It's a privilege to welcome you here today. Can you all hear me all right? Excellent, good. So my name is Claire Ransom, and I am the youth advocate from WMO, and it's my great privilege to welcome you all here today to this very important discussion. We are here today to talk about how we feel and think about climate science. So the WMO, the IPCC, and the Mary Foundation are primarily scientific institutions, but I always come to it from a background of feeling very familiar with the work that we do, but I would love to see just a show of hands. Do you guys all know what WMO does? Thumbs up or thumbs down if you know who WMO is. Or a thumb in the middle of ish, kind of. Okay. What about the IPCC? Do we know? Everybody knows IPCC, yes. Okay, how about the Mary Foundation? Yes? No? Medium. Okay, so we all kind of have a general understanding, it looks like, of what these organizations are, but maybe not too much. And that's pretty typical, I'm afraid, because we're very sort of scientific. We're coming from a lot of data, a lot of science about the way that the climate is currently at and where our ecosystems are. But unfortunately, we don't have very much of the human side of things. So behind all of these numbers and behind all of this data are real people. There are you and I who are experiencing climate change and climate impacts every single day. And increasingly, our increasingly young communities who are grappling with very complex emotions about this crisis. So for many of us young people, the climate crisis is not just an abstract threat. It's something real that's happening now and that's causing a lot of really complex emotions, whether it be fear, frustration, and maybe even grief. So I'm sure it will shock none of you to know that in 2020, the American Psychological Association surveyed a group of young people and older generations, and they found that nearly half of all the respondents from 18 to 34 reported that climate distress impacted their daily life. Their daily life. Imagine, and some of you might be able to, that climate is then something that's worrying you on a daily basis. But yet, young people are somehow also portrayed as these symbols of hope, of energy, of the future. So how do we grapple with that? How do we move from this idea of climate anxiety into action? And that's primarily what we're here to discuss today. So the idea of the event is really to bridge this idea of science and human experience, to hear from you all, our youth leaders, on how you're feeling and how we can move from our complex climate emotions and maybe a sense of anxiety into action. So we hope in the WMO, IPCC, and Mary communities that we can check in on sort of your emotional well-being to bridge the gap between science and emotion and to create a space for dialogue, connection, and resilience. We hope to have you have a space where your voices matter and help you see that you are part of shaping the future in this climate crisis that we find ourselves in. So today I'd just like to give kind of an overview of how the sessions will work. We're going to first start with an activity to get everybody kind of up and moving and feeling comfortable discussing this complex idea of emotions in the climate space. And so what we're going to do is just a couple minutes, I'll have you turn over here to my left. We'll see that there are some sticky notes on the wall. And you're just going to put a sticky note based on the one feeling that you feel best represents how you're doing today or overall how you're feeling about climate change. So we've got a couple, not the unsure or neutral, so sorry, there's no white ones. You'll have to pick whether you're feeling sad, angry, anxious, hopeful, or inspired. And that's really then going to let us see in a visual way where we're at in the audience and where we're at sort of overall. From there, we'll jump into our keynote presentation, which will be on the general impacts of climate change on mental health, to give us kind of an overview of what does the scientific world know? What do we already know about how we're feeling and how that's impacting us? And then from there, we'll really jump into the parts that I'm most excited about, which are then going to be on hearing from our actual leaders today in the child and youth space of how they're feeling and how their emotions have really driven them to action. So I'll stop there, and I'm going to ask all of you to get up and to pick a sticky note just really quickly. It's hard to pick, I know, but what's most representing your feelings, and then we'll get started. Okay, it's looking like a tight race. All right, we are exactly tied between hopeful and anxious, which I'm not sure that I had any expectations for how we would be feeling, but that seems about right for this space, that we are equally, hopefully, feeling the anxiety and this sort of sense of being unsure about where we're headed, but also hopeful. And I hope by the end of the panel today, we'll understand those emotions a little bit more and maybe be headed toward the more hopeful side rather than the anxious side. But to get us all going, I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker, Haley Brown, who is going to be giving us an overview of the mental health space and climate change overall. She's a grad student at the Scripps Institute for Oceanography, but has a background and has worked for several years in the space of mental health and the impacts from climate change. So without further ado, Haley, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Claire, and thank you all for being here today. So I'm excited to give some backdrop on just this intersection of mental health and climate change, and then going to turn it over to awesome groups of youth advocates to talk about experiences and solutions at this nexus. So as many of you know, climate change has been named the greatest global health threat facing the world in the 2022 Lancet Countdown, and has profound impacts on mental health. As reflected in the announcements for the 2024 countdown, there is increased urgency to include mental health considerations within adaptation and mitigation efforts. The effects on climate change on mental health are direct, indirect, and disproportionately distributed. Climate change disproportionately impacts mental health through extreme weather events such as floods, fires, storms, and persistent drought, and through indirect effects such as land loss, economic loss, migration, and food insecurity. Evidence suggests that climate change is associated with an increase in depression, suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, anxiety, PTSD, interpersonal and gender-based violence, and substance use. These impacts include not only clinical conditions, but also impaired cognitive functioning, emotional or behavioral control, economic productivity, and social cohesion. Even without the added strain of climate change, significant disparities exist between mental health needs and existing support systems. The stigmatization of mental health, coupled with its often non-clinical presentation, discourages it from being prioritized on par with traditional medical care. This results in a lack of resources and attention, further widening the gap in access to mental health services. This is especially the case in low and middle income countries where less than 20% of those seeking care receive adequate support. Climate change threatens to widen this gap as frontline populations in disaster-prone areas face a silent pandemic of mental health challenges catalyzed by extreme weather events and disasters, involuntary migration, and chronic stressors. Research indicates that rising temperatures significantly increase the morbidity and mortality linked to mental illness, as well as the frequency of psychiatric emergencies. It's estimated that for every 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature, there is a 2.2% increase in mental health-related mortality and a 1% increase in morbidity. Despite contributing the least to greenhouse gas emissions, low and middle income countries in the global south face the harshest impacts of climate change due to rapid warming, lack of infrastructure, and reliance on natural resources. Limited access to health services, social marginalization, and precarious living conditions all contribute to an inability to cope with climate impacts, increasing the burden on mental health. These structural vulnerabilities leave them less equipped to manage the cascading mental health crises exacerbated by climate change. This is particularly the case for women and girls, who are bearing the brunt of climate change adverse mental health effects. Studies show women are more likely than men to suffer the adverse impacts of climate change, and this is partly due to women's greater dependence on natural resources and prominent agricultural role worldwide. Further, instability and climate-related involuntary migration are associated with an increased threat of gender-based violence and sexual violence, which disproportionately impacts women and girls. Youth are also uniquely vulnerable to the mental health impacts of climate change, facing not only its immediate effects, but also the long-term consequences that will shape their futures. Climate change impacts youth and young people in different ways, as they generally have less agency to affect change than adults, and are growing up impacted by the knowledge and witnessing and experiencing these impacts. Importantly, it is their future that is threatened by the immediate and long-term consequences of the climate crisis. A majority of surveyed youth at a global scale are experiencing impairing distress on a daily basis and no longer trust governments and institutions. Surveys to date suggest that the lack of institutional and corporate commitments to tackle climate change exacerbates youth distress, lack of confidence in government and other institutions, and experiences of betrayal. How this disaffection may affect the social fabric and general community well-being needs to be better understood, but it is a substantial cause of concern. Across all stages of childhood and adolescence, youth face serious risks to mental health and cognitive health from the impacts of climate change. Before a child can even be born, exposure to weather disasters, high temperatures, and pollution and maternal anxiety during pregnancy can disrupt the normal development of physiological symptoms, cognitive abilities, and emotional regulation. These effects are often long-lasting and in some cases irreversible. Young children face growing exposure to extreme weather, heat, air pollution, displacement, and distressing climate news. These stressors are linked to anxiety, sleep disruptions, PTSD, increased emergency room visits, slower cognitive development, learning challenges, and major depressive disorder. For adolescents who are undergoing critical neural and cognitive development, the mental health impacts of climate change are amplified in comparison to adults. These impacts include disrupted education, financial and family stress, displacement, food insecurity, and processing bleak climate projections. These stressors can impair cognitive functioning, decision-making, and academic performance, while also increasing risks of depression, strained relationships, lower self-control, climate anxiety, and suicide. From a 2023 study of 200 adolescent survivors of the Yash cyclone that hit West Bengal, researchers found that scores for PTSD in these adolescents were alarmingly high. The usual cutoff score for probable PTSD on the PCL-5 scale, used to diagnose PTSD, is between 31 and 33. These adolescent survivors scored an average score of 70.67, with a standard deviation of 4.61, where girls were especially vulnerable to higher scores. Addressing these challenges requires proactive, age-specific mental health strategies to protect the well-being of children and youth in a changing climate, and systems-level solutions to tackle climate change, such as the rapid and equitable phasing out of fossil fuels. The compounding relationship between mental health issues and climate change exacerbates their respective negative impacts. Climate change acts as a threat multiplier for the risks of mental illness and climate-related involuntary migration. Extreme weather events and rising global temperatures compound existing stressors by individuals and communities, which has deleterious impacts on mental health, particularly for those groups already at risk of greater impacts, including youth and women. Just this week, the Philippines has been hit by 4 typhoons in just 10 days. I want to emphasize that this is more than just climate anxiety. We are no longer afraid of what is to come, but we are actively experiencing it, and there are disproportionate impacts in that. I want to shift a bit to focus on some of the research that highlights the hope and resilience that is ingrained in our shared humanity. Climate change encourages strong emotional responses, and while this includes understandable psychological distress, it can also include an increased motivation to act. Climate action, including both macro-level policies and micro-level behaviors in order to mitigate or adapt to climate change, can improve and prevent adverse mental health outcomes, especially in youth. The changes that may occur from climate action have the potential to improve mental health through determinants known to reduce mental illness, such as social cohesion and community well-being. The true first responders in disasters are often not state-sponsored emergency services or doctors, but the families and community members directly affected, those who rise to the challenge and lead mitigation efforts in the moments of disaster. This reality underscores the vital role of empowering communities and prioritizing their resilience as we prepare for the inevitable impacts of climate change. The growing evidence calls for immediate action to address both the emotional and clinical mental health impacts of climate change in communities already grappling with systemic inequities. Mental health intervention is too often reactive rather than preventative. To translate research into climate mental health aligned policy and practice, a shift to preventative approaches is essential. Preventative approaches may include retraining or upskilling whole workforces, including key stakeholders like health leaders, policymakers, educators, mental health professionals, and emergency responders. Mental health and psychosocial response must be seamlessly integrated into climate adaptation and disaster management plans, focusing on those most at risk. These preventative approaches can contribute to a more seamless transfer of skills from the micro so grassroots and community levels, to the macro, policies at national and international levels, which has the potential to minimize population-level distress pre- and post-disasters. Current adaptation and risk reduction strategies such as infrastructure upgrades, expanded essential services, and green infrastructure often fall short of addressing the mental health challenges posed by climate impacts. A holistic approach to climate adaptation should integrate mental health considerations into these interventions. This looks like co-designing interventions and policies, sharing decision-making, and creating a loop of knowledge exchange with local and indigenous communities and those already responding to these crises. Further, developing education and awareness initiatives must involve key institutions such as mental health systems, schools, universities, and community leaders to provide climate-informed mental health support and promote participatory and collective climate action. Turning to these types of organizations and social networks as anchors for mental health and psychological resilience makes sense, especially as they are already often fulfilling this role in similar ways. For example, schools and other youth-facing institutions around the world have adopted more psychologically informed and nurture-promoting methods within their teaching and learning approaches, positioning them as credible entities to reach out to or be a trusted place for engaging with parents, youth, and other community members and institutions. Recognizing youth's potential to be climate advocates and integrating indigenous practices of environmental defense and protection further enriches preventative strategies. At every level, these preventative approaches can help the shift of climate change as a threat multiplier to one where climate action is viewed as an opportunity to build collective efficacy and social cohesion, known determinants of mental well-being across communities and whole societies. I want to end with a call to action. Research shows that connection is the key to tackling the mental health and climate crises. Together, youth can move the needle. It's time to channel the power and passion that youth harness into action by building coalitions that unite voices, ideas, and resources. This can happen by reaching out to your peers, communities, and governments and sharing your vision. Collaborate to create projects, campaigns, or events that integrate mental health and psychological resilience into climate resilience. Share stories, spread awareness, and support each other, because collective action has the power to drive systemic change. Youth are the backbone of climate resilience, bringing energy and vision to the work that is already underway in their communities. By continuing to champion mental health and well-being and fostering connection, young people can help shape a future that champions well-being in the face of oncoming environmental shifts. Thank you all for being here today. I'm excited to hand it back to Claire and over to the panel of incredible youth in our midst. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Haley. I think I speak for all of us here to say that that was a truly remarkable way to set the stage. Thank you so much. It was certainly depressing in the beginning to hear all of the tremendous ways in which climate can impact and does already impact our mental health, but I so appreciate you really bringing us into the call of action at the end, because we couldn't agree more that we really have an opportunity here to bring climate action into exactly this, as an opportunity for social cohesion, and especially as youth to then be the champions that can bring in our psychological as well as physical well-being into the conversation. So thank you so much for that. Looking forward to hearing more from you in the Q&A. But now it's my great pleasure to bring us into the next section of our dialogue, which is going to be focused on our children and adolescent perspectives. So really hearing from these young voices that we've heard so much about, the theory of how they're impacted, to actually get to understand how it is that they're experiencing climate change already. So I would like to invite Grishma up to the stage, and Gabrielle as well. Both two very young leaders, and if you guys can grab a seat. Yeah, thank you. Who I'm going to let introduce themselves, because I think they'll be able to tell their story much better than I will. But we're going to start with the first question on the panel today, is that if you could just introduce yourselves, and I don't think you'll need the headphones, you can pull those off. If you can introduce yourselves to all of us here today, tell us a little bit about your story, how it is that two such young women have arrived in Baku at COP29 at this conference, and particularly thinking about the role of how your emotions have led you to where you are today. So I'll hand it over to Grishma first. Please go ahead.
Namaskaram. Can you hear me? Namaskaram. I'm Grishma, and I'm a 14-year-old climate advocate from India. and I am here representing the hashtag Decarbonize program run by the Center for Global Education, which is an NGO based in Canada, and I'm really excited to be here. But I'm also, the reason I've come here is because I'm anxious. I'm scared, and I'm worried about the uncertainty that lies in my future. And coming here has given me a little bit of hope, but I still think there's a long way to go from where we are right now.
Great. Thank you so much, Grishma. Not great to hear the anxiety, but we're glad to have you with us here today. So now, Gabrielle, I'll hand it over to you. I want to pass the mic. If you could just give us your introduction and how you're feeling.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gabrielle. I'm 15 years old, and I come from the Pacific Island nation of Vanuatu. I'm here with Save the Children Vanuatu with a program called the Next Gen Youth Ambassador Program, which kind of gives us the global stage and also teaches us special skills that we need to be good climate activists. And I'm also here because Vanuatu is a country that's really vulnerable to climate change. We get extreme weather events, drought, sea level rise. There's a lot of impacts, both social and physical, that climate change has negatively on us. And I'm here at COP because I want some change.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for being here, and we're glad that we're able to hear your voices. So just given the background that we heard from our keynote presentation and sort of the general knowledge that we know already about the impacts of climate change onto mental health, I would love to hear from both of you a little bit more in detail about how you were feeling about climate change overall before you came to COP29. And if you could maybe give us a little bit of information of how did you first find out about climate change? Was this something you learned in school? Was it something you were seeing on social media? And sort of your journey and your emotions and how that's brought you here. Thanks. So Grishma, over to you first.
Breaking news. The planet is burning, the sea levels are rising, and we might all die tomorrow. At this point, I don't think I consume news. The news is consuming me. And my eco-anxiety mostly sprung out from reading so many articles about the planet screaming and all of these ecological concerns that are going to shape my future. Sometimes I feel like the end of the world is near, and sometimes it's very, very easy to lose hope. And sometimes I want to scream at politicians, at corporations, and all of these big companies that are projected as responsible for climate change. I'm afraid, I'm anxious, but I'm also guilty, and I feel powerless. But if there's one thing I've realized, it's that we cannot afford to be powerless right now, because every single one of us in this room, whether it's a CEO or whether it's a student in a classroom, we all have the power to create change. And let me get something straight right now. Most people falsely assume that when we as the youth try to advocate for climate change, we're very aggressive about it, and we mostly want to play a blame game, but I want to change that. Climate change is not about a blame game. It's about realizing our collective responsibility to shape our future. And it's about the recognition that every choice that we make matters. Whether it's about a sustainable fashion trend that you choose, or whether it's just about eating vegan. I don't know. Every small action that we take contributes to a bigger change in society. And to answer the question about the earlier question, I started learning about climate action mostly through news and journalism, and it induced a lot of anxiety in me, like I already mentioned, because there's just so much negativity and there's so much talk about the problems, but there's not really anything about the solutions or the steps that we as individuals can take. And another horrible thing is that climate education is not prioritized in schools, and we don't really get to talk about climate change in schools. Even if we do, it's mostly about complex mathematics or science. It's not about what we as the inheritors can do to change the planet for the better. So that's really horrible, and I feel like countries and policymakers should take a step towards prioritizing climate education and making climate action available to everybody and understandable to everybody, because there's so much scientific jargon that most youth cannot understand. Like maybe I can, because I'm privileged to have education. But there's so many students out there and so many people who do not have access to education, and they don't know what they can do about climate change, even though it's not only the policymakers or the experts that are going to face the effects of climate change. It's everyone who can breathe, who can drink water, and who wants a better future or a better tomorrow.
I think that deserves a round of applause. Thank you so much, Grishma. That was really, truly an excellent answer, and it's great to hear that, unfortunately, that you all have identified these really big gaps, right? That the news is rather anxiety-inducing and really can make us feel this loss of solutions. But if we can bring more climate education into schools, hopefully that's not just going to teach our children and our future generations about the facts of climate change, but also what we can do about them. So now, Gabrielle, I'll hand it over to you. The same question, just kind of if you can expand upon how you're feeling and also a little bit more in your story on where you learned about climate change and if it was more in your educational system or from news and how that made you feel.
So for most of my life, I've known about what climate change is because of how vulnerable my country is to it. Every year we have a cyclone season from November to April. And that's the time where we're kind of always on the edge of our seats waiting for a cyclone to strike us, getting those resources ready. And climate change, it's a huge part of our lives in Vanuatu because it's stealing not only like essential aspects of our culture, but as children, it's also taking away our future. So I've always had kind of a negative perspective on it because if we don't make a change now and if we don't stop these types of greenhouse gas emissions and go phase out of fossil fuels, our land will be taken away. And as a small island state, we have nowhere to go if sea levels rise, and we don't want to leave our country, and we have the right to stay because of how connected we are to it and how it's embedded into our culture and identity. And yeah, just to link back to that kind of mental health aspect, when stats show that when a cyclone strikes, there are really high anxiety levels in children around Vanuatu. So that's rising up as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And I think especially the perspective of coming from a small island state, it's something where we often hear that children have their future being taken away. But in Vanuatu, we're seeing it in real time, right? It's not just the future, it's what's happening today on the ground. And that's, of course, gonna spark some negative feelings. So I hope now the question that I have for the two of you will bring in a little bit of positivity, hopefully, which is I would love to know a little bit about how your thoughts about climate change and the general sort of future have changed since coming to COP29. And if this is your first COP, which I'm assuming that it is, yes, how are you feeling about the processes and the events and the negotiations that you've been able to follow so far? So a little bit just to understand how has the inclusion in these spaces shaped the way that you're feeling? So Grishma, please.
To be completely honest, I think my anxiety has increased even further because although the youth is being given a voice and although I'm able to express my concerns, most people are committing to action, but I don't see that action materializing. And I feel like it's really important that this action does materialize. So yeah, it has been anxiety inducing, but I'm very happy that everybody that's here is actually recognizing the problem and is allowing youth to actually take part in discussions, and they actually are genuinely interested in what we have to say. So I'm really grateful and thankful for that. But I do believe that we need to take action quickly, or I don't know if there's going to be a future.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your honesty. I appreciate that. How about you, Gabrielle? How are you feeling about everything since coming to COP?
Yeah, to be honest as well, I kind of had the perspective that, at COP we would hear all these people saying kind of empty words, making empty promises, but to see how many young people have turned up and are being represented at the events and even in the negotiations, that's sparked a lot of hope, because to see them taking their voices, I think the urgency of the climate crisis is being seen more than before.
Okay, good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. And I think we all know that COP process can be a lot of talking, right? It can be a lot of telling, here's what all the action that needs to be taken, and not actually seeing a lot of what is going on the ground. So maybe for my final question to you ladies, I'd love to know how you're feeling about the future. And maybe to add on to that, just for everybody in the room, if you have a message that you would like to share to the delegates, to the people in the room, and maybe a call to action to them. So just a closing note of how are you feeling, and if there's anything you'd like to say to COP overall.
I'm anxious, but I'm hopeful. I'm exhausted, but I'm also exhilarated. If there's one thing that I would tell everybody here, it's that, especially the youth, your voice matters. Even though you take small actions, I feel like small actions are what lead to big systemic change. And it's really, really important that each and every one of us make these small sustainable changes to our lifestyles, because most people blame it on big corporations or big governments and everything, but we are those corporations and we are that system. We are individuals. Even those corporations are made up of people, and if those people consciously take the effort to mitigate climate change, I feel like it might actually happen, and that's why I'm hopeful, but I don't know if it will happen.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Let's give maybe another round of applause. Gabrielle, over to you for the last word.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what she said, but yeah, looking around me, I think it seems pretty promising seeing the future leaders, how we're not afraid to speak up for what we think is right and for what we have the right to. Yeah, so I think we will be able to turn the tide and focus, and we need to focus not on what we have lost, but what we can save. And what I would like world leaders to know is that climate change is real, and it's not a distant threat. It's here today, and it's impacting all of us, whether we realize it or not, and one day it will.
Yeah, absolutely. A round of applause. Thank you so much. That's great words to end on. It's a very hopeful end of let's not focus on what we've lost, but what we can save. So with that, thank you so much, ladies. I really appreciate you being here. I'm going to ask you to kindly grab a seat back in the audience and stick around for the Q&A. Big round of applause for these ladies. Very inspiring panel. I do a lot of work with youth, but it's definitely something that every time I find myself more and more impressed and a little intimidated about how eloquent of speakers you are. If they're starting off this young, I'm not sure where we go from here. So congratulations, really, both of you. And for my next panel, I'd like to bring up four really amazing young leaders. If Maria Sagar, Princia, and Meg could join me on stage. And JP, this is you. Yes, we've got an additional speaker. Apologies that you're not on the PowerPoint, but if everybody could join me up here, we'll bring the discussion forward. Great. Okay. Excellent. Thank you all so much. It looks like we are. Oh, here he is back there. Okay. Sorry, it's a bit of a tight squeeze. We can grab these, the headphones. I'll take these from you. Thank you. Yeah.